If Sunset Overdrive ever got a sequel, it would have the potential to become the best superhero game ever made. Now, with that incredibly bold and, if you think about it, completely meaningless statement out of the way, Sunset Overdrive 2014 has some issues. Every game in this young series of videos so far launched to critical success, but each also houses its fair share of problems, ones that become even more glaring when they're revisited years later. I think these are the types of games that most deserve a revamp though, a new sequel or a reboot, because these are the games that showed what they can do, but they still have something to prove. Sunset Overdrive fits that bill perfectly as an acclaimed title that stood out as one of the biggest highlights of the Xbox One generation, while also being shackled by the lack of understanding of the true capabilities of new hardware that presents itself in games that release within the first year or two of a console's lifecycle. Damn, lack of understanding of the true capabilities of new hardware that's present in games that release within the first year or two of a console's lifecycle, you kinky. Despite earning high marks across the board, I think Sunset Overdrive has a lot more left in the tank, and I'd love to see a sequel not just because of its quality, but also because I think it folds into Sony's future plans really nicely. That said, there's plenty of areas where it could use some improvements, so I think it's best that we start with if I had one big idea that I could present Insomniac with in their big annual "we let a bunch of random people off the street tell us what direction we should take on games that we probably aren't even working on" meeting, it would be this: conservation of energy, to which one of the employees would ask, "Wait, did you like invent it or something?" And I'd be like, "No, I just want you to use it, Insomniac guy. What are you, a fucking idiot?" For any game that prides itself on movement or a general free-flow gameplay loop, it's essential to avoid making the player feel like they've suddenly halted after making a single mistake. Solar Ash does a really good job of this. Even when you miss rails by accident and fall to the ground, you land with elegance and can immediately send yourself into a sprint. Ori does the same. The basic run, jump, and land animations are perfectly tuned to make you feel light as a feather, and I've endlessly praised how by the end you can just rip through the whole map without going under 100 miles an hour. This series is so serene, fluid, and fun, which is, ironically, apparently the exact opposite of what it's like to work at the studio that developed it. Sunset Overdrive commits a bit of a cardinal sin by making you feel like you're moving through molasses every time your feet wind up squarely on land. It's so jarring because free running and high-speed movement are the building blocks of this game, yet your regular running speed looks like you're fighting through the backdraft of a fighter jet. The game does a good job giving you some wiggle room with vaulting ledges and being able to bounce off a radius and height that's more forgiving than just the actual asset in question, but there's zero forgiveness for if you miss a grind or poorly plan out a jump and wind up on the pavement for a split second. All you can really do at that point is dejectedly hop back onto a nearby rail and start your movement up again, which is sometimes a bit cumbersome if you're in the middle of a fight. It's a very small thing, but it feels like the missing link in this whole equation. The game wants me to juggle weapon swapping, shooting, and all of this movement at once, but if I slip and accidentally move towards an area with no rail, or I focus on shooting without realizing that my line is coming to an end, I lose all momentum, and having a safety net for those instances to not even skip a beat would be a lot nicer. Interestingly, Spider-Man PS4 actually addressed this problem, one that was far less common in that game because you usually just pressed a button to stay in the air, but still it was nice to be able to counter. One of the traversal upgrades that you can acquire in that game lets you land and immediately vault out of a roll instead of winding up earthbound, and combining an option like this with the faster overall movement speed that would most likely be associated with the return to this franchise due to hardware improvements, Sunset Overdrive could achieve the perfect blend of parkour and superhero movement that the original was so close to. A generally faster speed of movement on the ground, and even the addition of a ground dash instead of just an air dash would also help in that regard. And although you can make the argument that the lack of fun movement on foot is necessary to convince players to engage with more exciting movement options, I think general fun factor and this skill bar right here are more than enough to do the trick, seeing as how this bar actively alters gameplay unlike others of its kind. Changing up your attacks and stringing grinds, bounces, dashes, etc. fills this bar up, and the higher it is, the more you get access to amps, which can add helpful effects to your melee weapon, turn traversal into a means of attacking, and even add damage to your dodge rolls, so you're highly incentivized to monkey around the city at all times. Those bonuses alone would have convinced players to play less safe without needing to completely stop them in their tracks when they're on foot. But I will say though, another thing that I wasn't the biggest fan of was the sheer number of upgrades and systems that were available for a pretty straightforward end goal. If a world does exist out there where we get a Sunset Overdrive 2, I hope the focus isn't on adding an extra heap of modifiers, and instead it's more on streamlining what's there. This game has 28 different range weapons, each one has its own level which increases the more that you use it, each one also has an amp slot which will have some effect when the weapon is used, but then there's also 5 different types of player amps which add effects to everything that you do, each with their own slot. On top of that, there's 4 different trap slots, and they all use power, which is a mechanic that's completely native to traps and traps alone, and on top of all of that, there's like 100 different overdrives which can be placed in 6 total slots that add small buffs to your character, which can also be upgraded individually using currency gained by different actions, not to mention buying weapons and amps is done through obtaining 7 different types of currency. Not only is all of this a lot to dump on a new player, but even as the game went on, I ignored some of this stuff because I couldn't be bothered to upgrade every 2 seconds. seconds. I left the default traps, and I picked a handful of overrides at random in the beginning and occasionally checked to see if I could upgrade any. All of these effects are pretty minute, a tiny increase to damage, a tiny increase to defense, and it would have worked well in a skill tree that you could just purchase and forget about, but asking you to choose between this many tiny effects is overwhelming for no reason. I like that Sunset Overdrive has more under the hood than it seems, but I wish that complexity didn't come hand in hand with a tangled mess of wires and spare parts.
Stay with me, this is almost over.
Most of my other issues with the game were smaller overall. For example, it seems to have started the tradition that Spider-Man carried over in side objectives that are mainly just picking stuff up around the city. There's a decent amount of side quests, but the game features 7 or 8 activities that come down to just grabbing stuff or pressing a button for it to auto-complete your task. I can't say I was ever as annoyed by this as other people were in Spider-Man, because I like how in a traversal-based system you're not being asked to constantly stop and do stuff, and I'm not super annoyed by it here either, but it was at least worth mentioning. The game also leans pretty hard on protection missions, where you're stopping OD from attacking something or someone. When you boil it down, I think almost half the missions featured something like this, but thankfully, as I'll get into in the next section, Sunset Overdrive manages to package these differently enough and add enough spice on top to avoid making it feel too samey. This whole experience is very loud and in your face, and attached to it is a heavy dose of humor, which I'll admit didn't always land and sometimes felt pretty forced. It sort of winds up in the guacamole pile for me as a game that everyone says is funny because it's trying to be funny, but just because it's trying doesn't mean it is. But also like guacamole, I think the attempts at humor still match the game well, and even if it isn't my cup of tea, it wouldn't feel complete with more nuanced writing. I'm still glad that the over-the-top humor was there, which leads us right into... Sunset Overdrive is fun. All it's trying to be is fun. It isn't trying to be poignant, it isn't trying to deliver a gripping plotline, it isn't bearing you in endless dialogue options, it just wants to be fun to play. And to that effect, everything from the art direction to the tone to the gameplay to what story is there is incredibly cohesive. Nothing feels out of place, and while some things it does are far from perfect, like the narrative and the humor, they still fit together to give the game a unique voice. The story at hand is a less serious take on zombie/alien apocalypse stories, down to the fact that the outbreak started as a result of a bunch of people pounding back a new energy drink. There's like a release party for this drink and everything, and you just know that everyone in this crowd is named Kyle. I like this idea of turning the apocalypse into a proper fun house. I feel like a lot of games have touched that line, maybe placed a toe over it, a few co-op games have even crossed it, but nothing's committed to it like this. It lets brainless enemies become fodder for your insane weaponry instead of posing a huge threat necessarily, creating more of a prolonged and highly controllable set piece rather than a fight to the death. Although these things can hit hard and get your ghost if you're not careful. In keeping with the tone and goals of this game though, you immediately respawn and head right back into the fight without losing any of your progress. In most games it would feel like you're being let off the hook too easy there, but in this game being knocked off your rhythm and having your meter reset is enough to bum you out and avoid death instead of being too cavalier about it. Respawn animations are also among the best thing this game puts out there. There's so many of them, around 20 I think. They're each more ridiculous than the last, and the overall gameplay loop is incredibly addictive. There's just enough means for traversal sprinkled in there to impart a sense of freedom, but not so much that you lose track of what you can do. Sunset Overdrive actually sets itself apart in its traversal when it comes to superhero games by making its system so active. Your character can't fly or glide, he's just good at jumping, rail grinding, ziplining, dashing, and vaulting, so you constantly need to be engaging with specific points in the world to make movement possible. Like I said, it's a good mix of parkour and superhero, which gives you more freedom and range of motion than other parkour games, but also doesn't remove world interactability like other superhero games do. In the Spider-Man and Batman games, for example, you can travel anywhere using the left stick and rhythmically pressing a button over and over if you wanted. There's ways of making the movement way more enjoyable, but you really can detach yourself from the world around you almost altogether in these games. Look at the Gotham Knights footage too. These traversal methods are basically playing themselves, but here you're constantly being pulled back towards Earth and need to re-engage with the city in order to move forward. And once you throw combat into the mix with all this movement, shooting zombies with energy drink harpoons, explosive teddy bears, acid sprinklers, and straight up fireworks, I mean, forget about it. Moment to moment, Sunset Overdrive is always thinking, what's the best way for the player to have fun? The narrative pushes this idea even further, handing out individual characters and often large groups of surviving factions that are pretty refreshing to see in comparison to all the self-serious groups you find in other dystopian settings. The college group was kind of a snooze fest admittedly, but before long you're tracking down an armless, legless general of a samurai code-abiding group of crazies, helping protect a group of LARPers who are still staying in character and maintaining their rudimentary weaponry despite everything going on, and being stepped on by a group of cheerleaders in Day of the Dead get-ups. I mean, being bossed around by, being punished. Sorry, I meant meeting. Slip of the tongue. These factions are all pretty unique, which I liked, and any chance the game gets, it likes to emphasize its writing and the tasks at hand with fun drawings, cute little text pop-ups, and a lot of fourth wall breaks, either from the main main character from whoever's giving you the tutorial. It might be trying a bit too hard at times, but I appreciate the tongue-in-cheek references to how game tutorials work and stuff like the end credits gag. For a game so boisterous, it only makes sense to have moments like these to match. None of this focus on fun would be worth anything though if the mission structure ran the mechanics into the ground, but thankfully the game succeeds here in a way that I wasn't expecting coming off the first few hours. Like I mentioned in the last section, a lot of objectives involve protecting something for a certain amount of time, a style of mission that's been greatly criticized in many games over the years, but the pitfalls associated with it are avoided here thanks to a bit of variation within that mission type. The least interesting missions in general are the ones where you have to protect the amp incubators from an onslaught of enemies for a certain amount of time because they all just play out roughly the same, but other protection missions have you saving a rock concert or commanding multiple catapults while you dart around shooting enemies or trying to split your focus between moving to different points, taking out OD and also pulling somebody into a dock or something. So many of these boil down to the same idea, but the game isn't lazy when doling them out. It also helps that the other missions feature larger than life bosses, escape sequences, souped up weaponry that lets you go berserk, tower ascents, and pigeon murder, which ensures the monotony is broken up before it becomes too apparent. Through a tight handle on the core loop, a wacky premise and story filled with eccentric characters and well thought out mission structures, Sunset Overdrive absolutely nails its goal of being a big, dumb, fun experience. It may have had a few elements that it should have tuned up, it may not have been a big artistic statement, but it provided something so enjoyable on its first crack at it that it's a shame that we never got a sequel to carry the torch. I'm not out of hope though, because given some of the information that's popped up over the last few years and given Sony's future plans, I do think there's a universe where this franchise does return. The immediate question that comes to mind is, hey wait a second, isn't Sunset Overdrive an Xbox exclusive and Insomniac is now owned by PlayStation? So how is that gonna work? Well, Sony actually does own the rights to the Sunset Overdrive IP, as well as every single other Insomniac IP, and not too long ago they actually filed a trademark for it. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean anything. We've seen plenty of instances where a company, especially Sony, trademarks an event or a game, updates a website, etc. with nothing coming from it, but seeing a trademark get filed is far from bad news. To boot, while it might seem like Insomniac has their hands tied with two massive upcoming superhero games in Spider-Man 2 and Wolverine, let's not forget that the teams leading those projects are largely being carried over from the teams of two of Insomniac's last three games in Spider-Man and Spider-Man Miles Morales. Same creative directors and everything, but the third team which worked on the new Ratchet & Clank has yet to announce their next project. Of course, they could be split up and assigned to those two games given how huge they're bound to be, but considering Sony's vocal push to supersize its development studios and churn out more games, I doubt Insomniac narrows its focus instead of maintaining the multiple well-oiled machines that have been operating there for a while. That's all to say, there's a good chance that Insomniac is working on something other than these two games, and for the record, the creative director in charge of Rift Apart, Marcus Smith, who's the one who's floating around now, was also one of the creative directors of Sunset Overdrive. I'm not saying a sequel is in the works at the moment, but logistically it very much could be. It's just a matter of if Sony wants to make it, so why would they want to make it? To me, Sunset Overdrive is a franchise that lets you branch out from the current Sony brand while also not straying too far from its core, almost like a gateway drug to a more diverse modern PlayStation catalog. It's a mature third-person action-adventure game, the publisher's forte, that's far less serious and more focused on balls-to-the-wall action over gripping storytelling than basically every other first-party game coming out of PlayStation right now, even Spider-Man. More than that though, it has a serious potential to grow and expand into a realm of gaming that Sony has been keen on pushing pretty hard over the next few years: multiplayer. Based on interviews and their plans for newly acquired studios, it's become pretty clear that PlayStation wants to equip itself with more multiplayer modes from its major franchises and more ongoing titles. Bungie is reportedly going to have a hand in a dozen live service Sony games that will be released by 2025. No, you did not hear that wrong. Sony wants 12 live service games to be put out with Bungie's support in the next 3 years. And the expansion of The Last of Us factions, along with Ghost of Tsushima's Legends mode, shows what part of the strategy is going to be with these games. Give the players single-player franchises that they're invested in, and create multiplayer experiences off of that which are developed by our star studios. Of all of Insomniac's IPs, Sunset Overdrive has some of the most potential to work in a multiplayer setting. It's really either this or Resistance. The original game already features a co-op mode where you team up against OD, but I could see this backbone working as a PvP multiplayer as well, maybe even a battle royale, as much as that phrase sends shivers down people's spines. Say what you will, but I think the high-flying action, parkour, and kooky weapons would lend themselves really well to a battle royale, and with Insomniac being one of your most reliable and beloved studios, I doubt you sideline them from this live service push. It might be a bit of a long shot, and the original's poor sales might be cause for Sony to continue avoiding this IP, but in a lot of ways, from the open slot to the available creative director to how well this franchise would align with Sony's long-term goals in comparison to Insomniac's other titles, it feels like right now might just be the perfect time for a sequel and even multiplayer spin-off of the 2014 original. Like I said in the infamous Second Life video, the more common superhero games are becoming, the less we're seeing original original, non-comic superheroes take center stage. And coming off Sucker Punch's declaration that Infamous is currently not being worked on by them or any other studio, the hope of a return to original superhero games lies on Sunset Overdrive. It helps that in a weird way, this actually feels like the most central game in Insomniac's catalog. It takes pieces of everything they've made both before and after this project and places it in one giant melting pot. The crazy weaponry and rail grinding of Ratchet & Clank, the superheroic movement and even voice actor from Spider-Man, the on-the-nose humor from both, the mindless alien apocalypse from Resistance, and even the fire spitting of Spyro. As it stands, Sunset Overdrive is the best representation of Insomniac as a whole. Maybe not their best game, definitely not my favorite, but the most representative. And for that reason, and everything that I just mentioned, I really think Sunset Overdrive deserves a second life. What do you guys think? Are you a fan of the original game? Do you think there's any chance that we see it come back? And do you think a sequel will lead to a multiplayer project? I have a hard time wrapping my head around what Insomniac could do multiplayer-wise from anything other than their currently dormant franchises in this and Resistance, and maybe a new IP, I guess, so I have my fingers crossed that that's reason enough to bring it back. Let me know what you guys think in the comments. If you enjoyed the video, leave a like. If you're new here, subscribe, and I'll see y'all next time. Peace.